Amidst the bustling Christmas atmosphere, music echoed through the streets as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Laughter mingled with the white drifts, creating a warm and festive glow that seemed to wrap around everyone. Within the crowd, a small family strolled happily. The daughter, enchanted by the lights, looked up at her parents and told them this was the best day of her life. However, their steps came to a sudden halt when a massive figure planted itself in the middle of their path. The little girl raised her wide eyes, filled with a mix of surprise and admiration at the sight of such a gigantic body. Standing before the small family, our protagonist remained in silence, staring back and not knowing how to react. After that frozen instant, he continued walking alone through the throngs of people, feeling a sense of rage and a profound loneliness growing deep within him. He trudged toward the subway entrance, his broad shoulders looking more forsaken and empty than ever. But just as he began to descend the stairs, he stopped abruptly as if he had discovered something. His gaze turned toward the side, recognizing a familiar, solitary silhouette. He realized that on this street there was another soul just as lonely as he was. It was an old man dressed as Santa Claus, kneeling on the frozen ground beneath the falling snow next to a sign that read, "Tell Santa your wish." Normally, he wouldn't have given it a second thought, but on this Christmas Eve, the memory of the accident that had snatched his parents away years ago and left him alone came rushing back. Stirred by a rare impulse of kindness, he pulled money from his wallet. He sat down, handed the old man a bill along with a carton of milk, and gently asked if it was still in good condition. He placed these small gestures tenderly upon the sign, a brief moment of warmth in the wintry night. But the old man suddenly grabbed his hand with surprising strength, exclaiming that he was truly a good person. Taken aback, the protagonist watched as the old man pleaded to reward him, begging him to state his wish. His face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and annoyance. He silently reproached himself for getting involved, and demanded that the old man let go of his hand. The old man's grip tightened with incredible force, leaving the protagonist completely stunned. He knew he had never been physically weak, yet he found he couldn't move an inch while the old man insisted. He had come specifically to grant a wish to someone so kind. Looking into the old man's eyes, he saw a desperate plea. The man claimed he could not return to Santa's village without receiving a wish to fulfill. Resigned and seeing no other way out, the protagonist sighed and asked if expressing his wish would finally set him free, receiving an energetic nod in response. After thinking for a moment and catching a glimpse of his own reflection, he began to reveal his desire. Though he first joked about winning the lottery, the old man dismissed this instantly, demanding a sincere wish from the heart. That request for sincerity brought them together in a moment of shared reflection. A deep melancholy washed over the protagonist's face as the loneliness of his past flooded back, and he realized what he truly craved was a family, a home that would never abandon him. With a bitter, lopsided smile, he finally expressed his true heart's desire. A wife as beautiful as a rabbit, and a daughter as adorable as a squirrel. Upon hearing this, the old Santa inhaled deeply, looking satisfied, as if he were drinking in the scent of a desperate longing and the soul of someone who had lived in isolation for far too long. He smiled a twisted, pleased smile, claiming he was lucky to have found such a kindred spirit. But in an instant, the old man's face turned sinister. His eyes glowed a haunting red as he promised to arrange a wife of pure heart and an obedient daughter. Just as quickly, his expression softened into one of deep emotion. He squeezed the protagonist's hand one last time and sincerely wished him a happy life. Terrified by the sudden shift, the man wrenched his hand away and bolted, convinced the old man was insane. Behind him, Santa's cries echoed through the snow, screaming that he would use all his power to make the wish a reality, and that the entire village of Santa was backing him. Shaken to his core, the protagonist scrambled into the subway station, desperate to leave the bizarre encounter behind. As he sat on the train, his hands hung limp between his knees, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of confusion. He stared out at the empty carriage, trying to process the old man's ramblings as nothing more than a localized madness. Yet he couldn't deny that he had actually voiced his deepest desire. Seeing a poster of a laughing family on the train wall only reinforced how much he truly yearned for that elusive happiness. Eventually, the rhythmic hum of the night train made his eyelids heavy, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. In the midst of a hazy dream, a strange, pungent scent hit his nose, accompanied by a chill that seeped deep into his bones. He jolted awake, disoriented and dazed, only to be struck by a wave of horror. He was completely naked. The biting air touched every inch of his skin, and an intense sense of dread washed over him as his surroundings came into focus. Before him, a horse-drawn cart creaked along, a dirt path through a village he didn't recognize. With rising panic, he realized he was trapped inside an iron cage, his legs bound by heavy shackles. Beside him sat a middle-aged man with long, matted hair and a thick beard, but he wasn't alone. The cart was filled with gaunt, exhausted people. Taking in the sight of the tattered rags and the crude iron grills, the horrifying truth began to sink in. This place looked as though it had been ripped straight out of the Middle Ages. Cold sweat broke out across his body as he struggled to accept the impossible reality before his eyes. The guards outside spoke in a guttural, alien tongue he couldn't understand, and there wasn't a single familiar face or modern comfort in sight. Whether it was a dream or a nightmare, he had to face the crude truth. He had been transported to another world. Time seemed to crawl in the damp, freezing confines of his mobile prison. He exhaled sharply, trying to keep his mind sharp, enough to analyze the situation despite the tingling numbness spreading from the cold stone floor through his bare feet. His gaze eventually landed on a fellow prisoner collapsed in the corner, and he wondered briefly if the man was even still alive. Realizing that the living must do whatever it takes to survive, he crawled over, whispered a soft apology, and began to strip the shirt from the unresponsive body. As he draped the tattered fabric over his own bare back, he felt a meager spark of warmth. Behind him, the corpse of the unfortunate prisoner lay cold and exposed on the floor, a grim and harrowing beginning to his new life. The terrifying promise of the crazed old Santa echoed relentlessly in his mind, and he feared that this was how his wish was meant to be fulfilled. He desperately wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but the days bled into one another as he remained locked in the iron cage, being hauled toward an uncertain fate. After a week of travel, he finally began to piece together the grim reality of his situation. First, and most importantly, they were all property. Second, the soldiers escorting them were not guards of a prison, but traffickers. They were being driven across the land to be sold to the highest bidder. Whenever the cart stopped in a new village, the soldiers would force the captives into a line, allowing local overseers to inspect them and pick out those with the strongest constitutions. Although admitting his status as a slave wounded his pride, a small spark of hope flickered within him. His physical strength was his only ticket out of that hellish cart. He was certain someone would choose him soon. However, as they passed through countless villages without him being picked, his confident smile faded into a forced, weary mask. Initial hope was slowly smothered by a suffocating blanket of despair. The cart rolled on, venturing deeper into strange, desolate lands that felt further and further from anything he recognized. Trapped in that narrow, cramped space, his body finally gave out. He collapsed onto the floor of the cage, wondering if there was any point in clinging to life. In a feverish haze, the memory of his kind mother drifted into his mind. He remembered her advising him to live a full life, no matter the circumstances. The image of his younger self, innocent and full of promise, flickered against the harsh reality of his current chains. He called out silently to his parents, his heart torn by the doubt of whether he could endure another day. Then the image of the mad Santa flashed in his mind. A surge of white-hot rage exploded within him. He didn't care about happiness or this new world. He just wanted it all to end. Spotting a discarded metal fork on the floor, he gripped it tightly, his teeth clenched. In that dark moment, happiness meant only one thing: the sweet release of death. But as the tines of the fork pressed against the skin of his neck, he froze. A final, stubborn shred of reason stopped him. He refused to die like a dog in a cage in a place like this. In the midst of this mental chaos, his deep-seated yearning for a home returned, and a soft, unfamiliar voice suddenly broke through his thoughts. He looked up, stunned, his breath catching in his throat. Through the iron bars, a hand reached out, offering him a simple piece of bread. The owner of the hand was a beautiful woman with a smile, so sweet and warm it seemed to radiate its own light. She placed the bread in his trembling palm, murmuring words in that strange tongue that he still couldn't understand. Then a small, adorable girl with golden hair peeked out from behind the woman's dress, watching him with wide, curious eyes. Overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of the pair, the fork slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The cart finally came to a full stop in front of a small, cozy cabin nestled deep within a serene forest. The scene shifted as he found himself brought inside, where the atmosphere was a world away from the cold iron of the cage. The woman and the little girl sat at a simple wooden table, sharing a meal in the soft glow of the hearth. The blonde daughter was busily slurping her soup with such infectious enthusiasm that it seemed to fill the room with life. Watching the child eat, the protagonist felt a strange, jarring realization wash over him: a wife as beautiful as a rabbit and a daughter as adorable as a squirrel. The old man's promise hadn't just been the ramblings of a lunatic. The recompense had begun. As the meal was finishing, the mother gently pushed her own bowl toward her daughter, urging her to eat more. But the little girl hesitated, looking up at her mother with wide, worried eyes. When the mother insisted she was giving up her portion, only because she knew the child was hungry, the girl objected, arguing that if she was hungry, then her mother Ridgie surely must be just as starving as she was. With a maturity beyond her years, the girl split the food exactly in half and pushed one bowl back to her mother, who sat momentarily paralyzed by the gesture. A look of profound warmth and happiness washed over the mother's face as she accepted, and the two of them began to eat together. Suddenly, a violent crash thundered against the door, and the booming voice of a man announced himself as the village chief. Before they could react, the door was kicked in, and the terrified mother pulled her daughter into a desperate, crushing embrace. The cold-hearted chief announced that, following their meeting, it had been decided that one of the men brought by the soldiers would become her new husband, and she was to prepare herself to go with him to the mountain. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left, barking a final order for her to bring food to the village gates at dawn to receive the soldiers. Completely shattered, the woman collapsed onto the floor as a wave of horror and the jagged memories of past beatings flooded her mind. Trembling uncontrollably, she held the child tight, knowing deep down that there was no escape from this cruel destiny. Looking down at the now sleeping girl, she thought silently that, although they had only known each other a short time, she could never abandon her. With tear-filled eyes and a heavy heart, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving the girl to face the world alone again. It was as if the child could sense her mother's agony even in sleep, as her own eyes began to well with tears until she finally broke into a pitiful, heart-wrenching sob. The sound of her crying filled the air of the dark cabin, mother and daughter clinging to each other in a shared, desperate grief that bled into the silent night. When the sobbing finally subsided, the woman sat in the darkness, staring at nothing and wondering what fate had in store for her. Huddled in the shadows, she swore a silent, ironclad oath that she would never again endure the atrocities of her past, and her gaze sharpened with a fierce determination. She would not allow the innocent girl sleeping beside her to suffer that same horrific fate. The poor girl was only 5 years old, a mere child, and the daughter of the woman's deceased husband. As the woman sat there, painful memories clawed their way back to the surface. The day her own father had sold her for nothing more than a rabbit skin. She remembered her first day in this very cabin. Before she had even unpacked her few belongings, the man who was supposed to be her husband had struck her. It had been a brutal beating over a triviality, simply because she had arrived slightly later than he had planned. That single moment had been a bitter awakening, proving that her life of horror was only just beginning. She recalled lying motionless on the freezing floor, thinking that a beginning could not possibly be worse than this. It was then that the violent man's daughter had approached her, watching her in silence with a complex, unreadable gaze as she lay bruised and broken on the ground. In that earthly hell, the girl with the innocent eyes had crept closer and sat softly beside her, a clumsy attempt at comfort, yet one that had managed to warm her frozen heart. She realized then that this child was the only angel who had accompanied her through those dark days. Since the day the violent man went up the mountain to hunt and never returned, it had been only the two of them against the world. The woman and the little girl had remained together, bound by a mutual need for survival in a world that offered them nothing else. According to the whispers of the villagers, the violent man had been torn apart by a pack of wolves, deep in the forest, and never returned. Upon learning of his death, she had felt a brief, flickering sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a vague, heavy dread that settled in her chest. Her somber expression reflected the harsh reality of her situation. In this lawless land, a woman without a husband was like a stray sheep separated from the flock, perpetually exposed to the wolves of society. At the following dawn, with a leaden soul, she led the girl toward the village gates to face the destiny the chief had decreed. Along the way, the child suddenly cried out, pointing ahead and pleading for her mother to look. There stood a cart with an iron cage, and inside, a figure sat huddled in the shadows. The mother froze in her tracks, her heart beginning to beat with an unusual frantic rhythm. As if drawn by an invisible thread, she took her daughter's hand and approached the cage. When the man inside raised his head, she gasped in recognition. It was the same man she had offered bread to before. In that instant, her eyes widened with a sudden, sharp terror as memories of the previous night's violence came rushing back. She remembered the late husband's face, how he would strike and curse at anyone he deemed useless. She also recalled the hollow, desperate look in this caged man's eyes when she had seen him, holding a fork to his own throat. Just as those terrifying memories threatened to overwhelm her, the village chief appeared, insulting them with cold contempt for causing a scene so soon after their meeting. He growled, blaming them for ruining his morning, and his dark, overbearing presence loomed over the pair as they trembled in fear. The image of the suicide fork remained etched in her mind, sparking a deep empathy for a desperation she knew all too well. Conversely, in the man's eyes, there was only the image of the mother and child, whose small act of kindness had quite literally pulled him back from the edge of the grave. Amidst this chaos of emotions, she reached into her basket and pulled out another piece of bread. Keeping her head low to hide the complex emotions swirling across her face, she offered the bread to him once more, a tiny, flickering flame of humanity in a world of cruelty. That moment of tenderness from the woman and the pure innocence of the child finally broke his resolve to end it all. He let the fork fall and abandoned his thoughts of death. However, the village chief intervened again, his voice like ice. He snatched the basket from her hands and ordered her to return to the village immediately so he could handle the reception of the new slaves. She obeyed in silence, forcing a fragile smile for her daughter to reassure her that everything was fine, though the child looked up with clear, perceptive eyes, sensing the wrongness in the air. Inside the cage, the man Juan clutched the bread, the last gift of humanity he had received. Driven by a gnawing hunger, he shoved a piece into his mouth, trying to reclaim whatever strength he had left. But the meager meal was brutally interrupted as two soldiers burst in, shouting without explanation. They dragged him violently from the cage and threw him onto the dirt, sending his precious bread flying into the mud. He and two other slaves were forced to their knees before the village chief, who declared coldly that the recruitment had begun. And then, a scene unfolded that would change everything. The scene that followed was nothing short of ghastly. Without a moment's hesitation, the two soldiers drew their blades and stabbed the other two slaves, massacring them savagely where they knelt. As the life faded from them, one of the soldiers dipped a finger into the fresh blood and began scrawling symbols onto a series of parchments. Instantly, the scrolls emitted an eerie, pulsing blue light, and Juan watched, frozen in terror, realizing he was witnessing true magic. Drenched in cold sweat, he wondered just how deep into this cruel and sinister world he had been cast. After a brief whispered discussion between a soldier and the village chief, the chief turned his attention to Juan, the sole survivor of the group. Juan looked up, his mind a blur of confusion and dread, completely unaware of what his fate would be. Meanwhile, back at the small wooden cabin, an elderly village woman arrived to see Rigi. She brought a heavy bag of provisions, instructing Rigi to take them with her. When she returned to the mountain house and explaining that the village would supply them with food for a short time, the old woman gave a blunt warning. She must remember that this new husband would not understand her language, and that every scrap of aid would eventually have to be repaid. Without mincing words, she confessed that no one in the village had actually liked Rigi's late husband. They had only tolerated his violence because the village lacked hunters. But this time was different. The man Rigi was about to receive might have been a commoner, but the soldiers whispered that while his face was rugged, his hands and feet were as soft and unmarred as a nobleman's. Taking Rigi's hand, the old woman tried to reassure her. By the look of Juan's unworked hands, they could trust he wasn't a brute, and if he worked well, they might finally live in comfort. Rigi, however, lowered her head, her voice thick with sorrow. She told the woman through quiet sobs that she didn't crave a comfortable life. She only prayed for a husband who wasn't violent. She would be happy if the man simply left her, and her daughter in peace in a corner of the house. At the next dawn, the fragile peace was shattered by violent pounding on the door. Rigi jolted awake, pulling her sleepy daughter into a protective embrace. Peering through a crack in the wood, she was stunned to see the village chief approaching, brutally dragging a man behind him. The chief burst inside and announced that he had brought the man she was to marry. Rigi gasped, the words "my husband" catching in her throat. As the chief barked orders at her to take him in, Juan was shoved into the room, stumbling and looking around in a daze, completely disoriented. Seeing Juguan wounded and exhausted, a rare flash of anger surged through Rigi. She cried out, demanding to know why they were dragging a hurt man like an animal. In that secret moment of realization, she understood that this poor, broken soul before her was indeed the man destined to be her husband. She looked at him, trembling with awe at his towering, massive frame, the likes of which she had never seen. Juan tilted his head slightly, his gaze clouded with confusion as he watched her reaction. Then a spark of recognition hit him. This terrified woman was the same one who had offered him the bread. He was left even more bewildered, unable to fathom why she was trembling at the sight of him. In that moment, the village chief grew impatient. He grabbed Juguan's hand, snapping at him for standing there paralyzed. Without waiting for a response, he hauled the giant man toward the two worried figures. The chief shoved Juguan until he was pressed right against Rigi, attempting to arrange them like a set of dolls. Seeing them both still rigid with fear and confusion, he forced their hands together, lacing Juan's fingers with Rigi's. He declared with a satisfied grunt that they were now husband and wife, and told them not to be shy. Standing there, their hands joined by force, the two strangers looked at one another, bound together in the shadows of a cabin in a world that had already taken so much from them both. Bound by force and confusion, Juan struggled to make sense of the chaos, though the heavy atmosphere began to reveal the gravity of his situation. Standing beside the beautiful woman, a wild, almost impossible thought crossed his mind. He suddenly recalled the sinister promise of the old Santa, regarding a wife of pure heart and an obedient daughter. As he looked at Rigi, with her sweet and fragile appearance, he instantly imagined her as a bride resembling a gentle rabbit. The little girl, with her large round eyes, looked exactly like an adorable little ground squirrel. Juan was in disbelief. Could that old madman actually have granted his wish? Yet, even as the realization dawned, a sense of deep grievance washed over him. To grant a wish by throwing him into a cruel alien world seemed like a sick joke. Why couldn't the old man have given him this gift gently, instead of forcing him through such immense pain and humiliation? He lowered his head, his hair shadowing a face that was darkening with a growing, silent rage. He ground his teeth and swore that if he ever saw that Santa again, he wouldn't hesitate to send him straight to hell. The sheer intensity of Juan's internal fury radiated off him like a ferocious bear, causing the mother and daughter, his rabbit and squirrel, to cower in instinctive fear. Following the forced introduction, the village chief and several other men led him into the nearby forest. The chief appeared to be explaining something at the top of his lungs, but Juan's head was spinning. He couldn't understand a single syllable of the guttural language. After the chief finished his one-sided explanation, he turned to the other men as if they were making a pivotal decision. Suddenly, a blond man stepped forward and extended his hand. Thinking it was a gesture of greeting, Juan responded politely and took the man's hand. But he immediately felt an extraordinarily powerful squeeze that was clearly a test of his strength. The blond man began to exert massive pressure, his face contorting with the effort, while Juan naively wondered if this was simply a peculiar local greeting. However, as the provocation became undeniable, Juan's brow furrowed. With a slight effortless counter-squeeze, Juan hoisted the young villager clean off the ground. The man screamed in desperation as he dangled in the air. A scene so shocking, it caused even the village chief to cry out in alarm. The blond man's hand turned a deep, angry red under the weight of Juan's incredible power. After that brief demonstration of raw strength, the young man was left on his knees, clutching his throbbing hand, while the chief began a fresh round of frantic explanations. Without further delay, he handed Juan a bow and a quiver of arrows, seemingly entrusting him with an important task. Juan took the weapon, wondering why it was being given to him, though he correctly assumed it wasn't for another duel. Seeing that Juan was still bewildered, the chief began to gesticulate with exaggerated movements. He even went so far as to imitate the hopping of a rabbit until a light bulb finally went off in Juan's head. They wanted him to hunt, but just as Juan felt he understood, the chief waved his hands in a panic, as if Juan had gotten it all wrong. He pointed urgently toward the thickets and screamed for him to shoot immediately. Juan followed the direction of the finger and saw nothing but a small white rabbit peacefully nibbling on leaves. He looked back with total confusion, knowing he had never used a bow in his life, but the chief wouldn't stop shouting for him to act. Despite his lack of experience, Juan adopted a professional-looking stance, though he doubted himself internally. After all, even an Olympic athlete could miss, especially when aiming at such a small, living target. Despite his doubts, he released the string, and the arrow flew with unimaginable force. The projectile whistled through the air, grazing the ground so closely that the rabbit leaped in terror and vanished into the safety of the thickets. Against all odds, the village chief began to jump for joy, leaving Juan utterly bewildered as to why he was being praised for a clear miss. The chief pointed enthusiastically at the empty patch of grass where the rabbit had been, explaining something in a rapid-fire tongue that Juan simply couldn't grasp. Suddenly, a familiar silhouette caught his eye, causing him to turn around. He froze, sweat trickling down his cheek, as he saw the mother and daughter approaching. For a fleeting second, he truly recognized that this woman with the sweet gaze and this adorable little girl were the very family he had wished for. His heart began to race, and a wave of shyness washed over his face. This sudden deep blush on a man of Juguan's stature left everyone confused, especially Rigi and her daughter. After that embarrassing introduction, they shared their first meal together in the peaceful grove, though a palpable tension still hung over the small newfound family. Sitting silently across from one another, Rigi prepared a simple, comforting meal, a bowl of hot soup filled with fresh vegetables and meat. As Juan prepared to eat, he couldn't stop glancing at the mother and child, noting their lingering timidity and worry. However, the simple act of him lifting his spoon caused them to flinch. He stopped, maintaining an expressionless mask on the outside, while his heart hammered against his ribs at their reaction. Then, a rare, warm smile spread across his lips, melting away his usual coldness. The word family echoed in his mind, a concept that had been alien to him through years of bitter isolation. Yet here he was, unexpectedly possessing one, a sensation that was both strange and profoundly comforting. While he remained irritated by the chaotic and forced process that brought him here, he could not deny the flicker of happiness settling in his chest. Juan looked up at the sky and exhaled, thinking that he would still love to teach that old Santa a lesson if they ever crossed paths again. But deep down, he felt a welling sense of gratitude. The following day moved quickly as the small family, accompanied by the village chief, began the trek back to the house on the mountain. Juan carried the heavy luggage with ease, but he constantly turned back to check on the mother and daughter, worried they wouldn't be able to keep up. From his vantage point, Rigi and the little girl already looked exhausted after only a short distance. Frustrated by the language barrier, he felt a surge of helplessness at his inability to ask how they were, or offer a kind word. He turned forward again with a look of resolve, promising himself that he would adapt to this new world as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks as a bold resolution took root in his mind. He recalled a piece of advice his mother had given him in his childhood. When you want to protect someone, you must not hesitate. The moment you feel the impulse to shield them, you must run to their side immediately. Holding that lesson close to his heart, he did not waver. He spun around and marched back toward the mother and daughter with absolute determination. They watched him approach, wide-eyed and visibly frightened by his sudden change in direction. The little girl's large eyes began to fill with tears, and her lip trembled on the verge of a sob. To calm her, Juan slowly lowered himself onto one knee, softening his expression into the kindest look. He could muster to show her that he only wanted to help. He only wanted to hold them for a moment to show them they had nothing to fear. But his towering presence and sudden movement only amplified Rigi's panic. Not understanding his intentions, she pressed her hands together in a desperate, murmuring plea for mercy, reactions that left Juan completely baffled. Seeing her mother's distress, the little girl could no longer hold back and erupted into heartbreaking sobs. Juan let out a long sigh, realizing that his mere presence was enough to terrify them. He decided then and there that he could no longer afford to keep his face a cold, unreadable mask. He spoke a single word, asking for permission even though he knew they wouldn't understand it, and then reached out to lay a hand gently on their shoulders. With a display of extraordinary strength, he lifted both of them at once as if they weighed nothing at all. Suspended in the air, mother and daughter were paralyzed by the unexpected action. But with a few deft adjustments, Juan settled Rigi against his broad shoulder and tucked the little girl securely into his other arm. His expression remaining as steady as a rock, Rigi stared at him in utter disbelief, unable to fathom the sheer power in this man's limbs. He shifted his stance with surprising delicacy, one arm supporting her and the other cradling the child, standing firm like a mountain. The little girl's initial terror transformed into sudden excitement, and she let out a small gasp of wonder. Looking down at her, Juan felt a warm, heavy sense of responsibility bloom in his chest. He turned his head slightly toward Rigi, his voice tender as he told her to hold on tight. As they began to move, he was startled to find that even with the luggage and the weight of 2 people, he didn't feel burdened at all. He made a silent vow to master the language and become the greatest hunter the land had ever seen, ensuring his new family would never go hungry for meat. Feeling Rigi's small hand tentatively gripping his shoulder, he knew his life from this point on would be busy and exhausting, yet filled with a hope he had never known. As they moved through the trees, he felt the warmth of her body against his, and a bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Suddenly, a soft hand touched him, a timid, unexpected gesture. Without a word, Juan raised his hand and covered hers, forging a silent bond between 2 strangers. In that moment, the shadows of fear seemed to dissolve, replaced by a growing peace as they found shelter against his strong back. Without a single complaint, Juan carried them to the very end of the trail, following the village chief until the mountain cabin finally came into view. The chief, looking grateful for the man's endurance, told him to rest before he eventually disappeared into the thickening mountain mist. Juan stood in the silence, watching the chief's silhouette vanish, leaving him alone with his small family. He looked up at the wooden cabin that was to be his new home and couldn't help but think it might be even colder than his old attic apartment. Bitter memories of the days he spent chained in the freezing iron cage flashed through his mind, fueling a lingering hatred for the biting outdoors. Shaking off the negative thoughts, he took a deep breath and placed his hand on the door, ready to open a new chapter. He pushed the heavy wood open gently and stepped into his home with a heart full of hope. However, he froze the moment he saw Rigi inside. Her face was a mask of confusion, her cheeks flushed a deep red. Noticing the glint of fresh tears on her face, he rushed to her side, asking frantically why she was crying. But his questions were met with total silence. Without warning, Rigi turned and bolted out the door, leaving Juan standing there in shock. Turning his gaze back to the interior of the house, his blood ran cold as he discovered the true state of their home. The house was entirely empty. Even the shelving units had been stripped from the walls. Juan stood frozen on the threshold, unable to wrap his mind around the stark, cruel reality before him. Turned out that while Rigi and her daughter had been at the village gates, the neighbors had descended upon the cabin like scavengers, stealing everything from the furniture to the very last tools needed for survival. Rigi curled into a ball, trembling from the biting mountain cold, falling into a pit of pure despair. Without tools to repair the house or weapons to defend against wild beasts, they were defenseless. When Juan finally found her huddled in the shadows, he spoke softly, acknowledging her presence. Without another word, he sat down beside her, maintaining just enough distance to be respectful while sharing the heavy, suffocating weight of the silence. Seeing her weep, he unexpectedly reached out and stroked her hair with a tenderness that acted as a silent balm. The gentleness of his touch caused her sobs to catch in her throat, and she looked up at him with glassy, startled eyes. He offered a small, reassuring smile, trying to convey that she didn't need to worry, and for a moment, it seemed Rigi truly felt the sincerity behind his gaze. Still, a cloud of confusion lingered on her face. This was the man she was destined to live with, yet they couldn't even speak to one another, and he, her supposed protector, seemed to have no idea how to hunt. In such an implacable wilderness, she wondered if they could truly survive. Contrary to Rigi's mounting anxiety, a faint, confident smile played on Juan's lips. He looked her directly in the eyes and, in a deep and resolute voice, promised to protect her, even if she still harbored doubts and fear. With great tenderness, He cupped Riggy's cheeks in his hands, a gesture of profound respect and protection. A single tear rolled down her face, not born of terror this time, but from the strange warmth and trust beginning to take root under the fading light of the sunset. As that tear fell, a rare sense of peace blossomed in Riggy's chest, leaving her wondering why this stranger's presence felt so incredibly comforting. Juan's thoughts drifted back to his old world, where he had been utterly alone since the death of his parents. He had always fought tooth and nail just to exist, and his hand instinctively tightened into a fist, as a silent affirmation of his strength. Now that he actually had a family, he had more reason than ever to be unyielding in the face of hardship. He struck his chest with determination, vowing to do whatever was necessary to provide for them. That silent promise was the breaking point for Riggy. The dam finally burst and she began to cry inconsolably. Without a word, Juan drew her toward him, allowing her to rest her head against his broad shoulder so she could finally let out all the pain she had been carrying. At that exact moment, the little girl, watching from a distance, came charging toward them in a fit of protective fury. She threw her small arms around Riggy from behind, shouting at the top of her lungs for Juan to stop bothering her mother. In an instant, the three of them were entangled in a clumsy, collective embrace, forming their first true image of a warm, complete family. As he held the sobbing woman, Juan felt an emotion unlike anything he had ever experienced. The little girl was crying now too, and the weight of the situation sent a whirlwind of questions through his mind. He wondered about the child's father, why this woman had been kind enough to give him bread when she had so little, and what tragedies had led to her tears. He pushed the doubts aside, believing that if they put in the effort together, they would become a beautiful family. Hugging them both tightly, he made a final resolute vow. He would make them happier than anyone else on earth. He would never let them cry again, and he would be the best husband and father this world had ever seen. He would do everything in his power to ensure that one day, they would never regret accepting him as part of their family. After that emotional peak, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the small wooden cabin that was to be their sanctuary. Yet, upon returning to the hollow interior of the house, the three of them sat across from one another in a familiar, distant silence. Juan thought to himself that the embrace would have brought them closer, but it felt as if they had been reset to square one. Riggy felt that this man was a total enigma, a stranger in every sense, yet she knew they had to find a way to coexist without even knowing where to begin. Suddenly an idea struck Juan, and he snapped his fingers to capture their attention. He leaned in slightly, determined to shatter the awkward wall between them. He pointed to his chest and introduced himself with a firm, clear voice. "Kim Juan," he said, repeating it slowly. "Kim Juan." He hoped that even if they couldn't converse, they could at least know each other's names. The gesture worked. Riggy looked up, surprised, and softly murmured the sounds back to him. Seeing her reaction, he extended his hand, wordlessly asking for her name in return. She hesitated for a heartbeat before whispering, "Riggy." She repeated it again, clearer and more certain this time. "Riggy!" Juan exclaimed with a bright smile. "Riggy, what a beautiful name." He then turned toward the little girl and asked her just as sweetly what her name was. The child didn't offer a word, instead curling timidly against her mother's side, which struck Juan as odd. Looking into her innocent but somewhat vacant eyes, a realization hit him. Perhaps she didn't have a name at all. A wave of profound compassion washed over him for the girl's unfortunate lot in life. Without hesitation, he reached out to stroke her hair tenderly and decided to gift her a name of her own. "Dorothy," he pronounced, evoking the girl from The Wizard of Oz. To him, it was the name of a brave girl who went on a grand adventure with loyal friends, a girl who fought for her own happiness and became beloved by everyone she met. The child tried to mimic him, her tongue tripping over the foreign sounds. "Tu grazie," Juan laughed softly, explaining that the name would bring her friends and affection. Hearing this, her face lit up with a radiant smile, and she repeated it perfectly this time. "Dorothy." To truly begin their new life, Juan set to work immediately, his axe biting into wood with decisive, powerful swings. From a distance, Riggy watched him in silence, pondering this strange man. He possessed a physique and a raw strength far greater than her late husband's, yet instead of being a brute, he was incredibly attentive toward her. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. He seemed to belong to another world entirely. She called out to him in a low voice, "Yuhan," and though she had no idea where he had come from, the sound of his name felt warm and sweet on her tongue. In all her life, she had never been shown such kindness, not even once. It made her wonder why this man was being so good to her. No matter how much she studied him, Juan simply didn't fit into the backdrop of this harsh, remote place. Suddenly, he turned around, smiled, and called her name, "Riggy." In that moment, she noticed something striking. His jet-black hair and intense dark eyes matched the persistent rumors. She had heard about a country at war that had successfully summoned a legendary hero with those exact features. A wild, impossible thought raced through Riggy's mind. Could there really be a legendary hero with black hair and black eyes standing before her? As Huan approached, she couldn't stop comparing him to the figure from the legends. Despite the similarities, she felt a lingering sense of doubt. Surely a grand hero wouldn't appear here, in a village so far removed from the rest of the world. Besides, the story of the hero was nothing more than an unconfirmed rumor. As he drew closer, Rigi felt a flicker of bashful confusion and tilted her head up to look at the tall, formidable man standing over her, her heart fluttering. With a mix of uncertainty and a hope, she was almost afraid to acknowledge. Upon looking closer, she realized that his hair was actually a deep dark brown rather than jet black, and his eyes shared the same earthy hue. Rigi let out a long, quiet sigh of relief, thinking to herself that he was likely just a man built more powerfully than average, but then her mind went blank. Why did she feel so relieved and serene when they had only just met that very day? Confusion played across her flushed face, creating an atmosphere that was both timid and tender. Suddenly, Huan reached out and stroked her head, a soft, lingering gesture that left her paralyzed, because she had never experienced anything like it. In her painful past, every male hand raised toward her head had signaled only ruthless blows. But this time, Huan's hand merely brushed through her hair with a gentleness that radiated a warmth she had never known. Instead of the usual instinct to cower, she felt remarkably comfortable, even wishing in silence that the sensation would last forever. For a fleeting moment, an intense desire surged within her. She wanted him to keep stroking her hair for all of time. Noting the subtle change in her demeanor, Huan drew her a little closer, his own face beginning to redden. Submerged in this newfound tenderness, Rigi's face radiated a rare peace and happiness. Without warning, Huan leaned in slowly, closing the final distance between them. An unexpected kiss brushed against her lips, leaving Rigi with her eyes wide in astonishment, yet she did not pull away. In that single instant, every worry and every inch of distance between them vanished, leaving only the sweetness of a first kiss. After the kiss, Huan pulled back abruptly, as if startled by his own boldness, his face turning a deep shade of crimson at his sudden outburst. He stammered, unable to find any words, his nervous hands fidgeting as he looked for a place to put them. His shyness was undeniable. To escape the suffocatingly awkward atmosphere, he hurriedly grabbed a nearby wooden bucket as an excuse. He gripped the handle as if trying to cling to what little composure he had left, and, without saying a word, he turned and ran toward the stream, leaving Rigi standing there alone and stunned. She remained in place, her face burning and her heart racing, still savoring the lingering sweetness of the kiss. Meanwhile, Huan walked alone by the water's edge, berating himself for acting so impulsively. He twisted with nerves, reminding himself that although they were husband and wife in appearance, they were effectively strangers who had met only hours ago. The more he overthought it, the more distressed he became. They didn't even speak the same language, and he had no idea how to navigate these uncharted waters. He simply paced aimlessly, trying to find a way out of his mental fog, lost in his thoughts. He moved forward without realizing how far he had wandered or where he was. Suddenly, a spine-chilling howl echoed from the depths of the forest, shattering the silence of the night. He jolted awake, casting aside his distractions and telling himself he needed to fetch the water quickly and get back. However, a shiver raced down his spine and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. From the thick darkness, a gigantic wolf emerged slowly, its eyes glowing a brilliant coal-like red. It blocked his path, growling low in its throat and bearing a set of terrifyingly sharp fangs. This was a true beast of the night. Huan took a tense step back, drenched in sweat as he faced the creature. The wolf radiated a murderous aura that chilled his blood. It was clearly a savage predator. He stood motionless, his hand white-knuckled around the bucket as he tried to maintain his calm before the imminent strike. Yet, instead of succumbing to fear, he lowered himself slowly, set the bucket aside, and stared back without flinching. He quickly grabbed a fallen log nearby, a crude weapon, but the only thing he could trust in that moment. He gripped it with all his might, his gaze unwavering and prepared for a struggle between life and death. The wolf lunged with terrifying speed, and Huan threw himself forward to meet it head-on. He used the log to block the wolf's devastating bite, the sheer force of the impact vibrating through his entire body. The impact forced him to exert every ounce of his strength. But the wolf was not only powerful, it was feral. Huan cried out in pain as he was flung backward, crashing into a tree with a force that left him dazed and seeing stars. Refusing to yield, he let out a roar of primal rage and lunged forward, desperate to seize the beast by its throat. He ground his teeth, determined that he would not die in such a godforsaken place, concentrating all of his will and survival instinct into one final stand. His eyes burned with the fire of a man pushed to the brink. With a guttural shout, he prepared to deliver a finishing blow to end the struggle once and for all. As he struck, a searing pain shot through his arm, as if his very life force were being consumed by a strange, surging energy. Suddenly, a sharp Ken sound rang out, and to his utter shock, an intense golden light erupted from his palm. The wolf growled, but the flame dancing in Huan's hand was far more ferocious, enveloping the beast as Huan watched in a state of complete stupefaction. The flames exploded with a violence and power he never knew he possessed. He managed to scramble onto the wolf's back, channeling every drop of this new power into his flaming fist, intent on bringing the predator down. He unleashed a devastating, fire-enhanced strike, a destructive attack that shattered the night. The wolf collapsed, its life extinguished instantly, leaving nothing but a dark stain of blood upon the earth. Even after the beast was still, Juan continued to throw punches into the empty air, his body acting on pure adrenaline as he purged the accumulated tension of the fight. Finally exhausted, he collapsed onto the grass, staring at his hands in disbelief. He was certain he had seen them ablaze, yet as he lifted them to the moonlight, he found his skin unmarred and his clothing untouched by the fire. It was an inexplicable mystery. Lying there attonito, he struggled to process the fact that he had just used magic. He recalled the strange blood rituals the soldiers had performed and realized that traveling through time and gaining powers was a common trope in the stories he knew. Perhaps he thought he had become one of those protagonists. He raised his hand toward the heavens and, filled with a sudden, intense hope, shouted, "Invoke fire!" But his command was met only with the rustle of leaves and silence. He tried again and again, his voice growing more desperate, attempting grander techniques like firestorm and flame wall, even shouting grandiloquent incantations like dragon's breath or spirit of the earth arise. After his efforts proved fruitless, he lay back down in disappointment. Though he knew the experience hadn't been an illusion, the wounds from his collision with the tree had partially healed themselves. Looking up at the stars, he realized that mastering this power would be his greatest asset in hunting and providing for his family. He smiled, imagining a bright future where he could give Riggy and Dorothy a life of comfort and joy. Moreover, in a remote village without a doctor, his newfound magical healing would be a miracle. He sat up, resolved to investigate this power further, certain that if it had manifested once, it would surely return. As he sat in the quiet, painful memories began to surface. Shortly after the death of his parents, he had also lost his grandfather, the only person who had truly cared for him. Though his grandfather had seemed healthy for his age, he had died in a senseless accident, leaving Juan vulnerable to the cruelty of his remaining relatives. He remembered the funeral vividly, how a relative had burst in and struck him, screaming that he was a curse who had caused the deaths of his father and brother. From that day on, everyone had treated him like a plague bearer, even though he was just a high school student trying to survive. Back in the present, Juan looked at the wolf's carcass with a slight, weary smile, pushing the old ghosts away. He hoisted the heavy beast onto his broad shoulders, knowing he needed to head back before more predators arrived. He knew skinning it would be grueling work, but it was possible. He thought of his grandfather again, remembering the days he spent watching the old man prepare chickens and rabbits on the farm. He looked at the moon, thinking that if his grandfather could see him now, he would be proud. Yet one nagging question remained. How could he learn to control this wild, dormant magic? Inside the cozy warmth of the cabin, Riggy and Dorothy were busy preparing the evening meal. Dorothy ran with boundless energy to bring a bowl to Riggy, her small face alight with expectation. Riggy smiled, taking the bowl and thanking her daughter, which caused Dorothy to beam with a smile as pure as the morning sun. After helping her mother, the little girl skipped happily around the house, playing near the glowing hearth. Suddenly, a strange sound from outside piqued her curiosity, and she stood on her tiptoes to peer through the window. She tilted her head, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness. But when a gigantic wolf suddenly appeared right before her eyes, Dorothy let out a blood-curdling scream. The girl fell backward in terror as Riggy, heart-pounding, called out for her daughter. Without a moment's hesitation, Riggy grabbed her rustic kitchen knife, a meager weapon, but the only thing she had to protect her child. She ran toward the door, screaming for Dorothy to get behind her. When she flung the door open, the scene left her paralyzed and drenched in a cold sweat of fear. There was Juan, kneeling on the ground with the massive carcass of a wolf draped over his shoulders, looking at her with exhaustion written across his face. Thinking the beast was in the middle of attacking him, Riggy screamed his name in desperation, consumed by a protective terror. Seeing them rush out, Juan was caught off guard and called to them in confusion. But Riggy didn't stop. She raised her knife high, determined to defend her man. It was only when she realized the beast was dead that she let the knife slip from her fingers, her body stiffening with a sudden, overwhelming wave of embarrassment. She rushed to Juan, embracing him and asking frantically if he was hurt. Juan, startled by the outburst, hurried to reassure her that he was fine. Dorothy arrived a second later, clinging to Juan's legs with tearful, worried eyes. Juan smiled, trying to calm them down, explaining that the wolf had only managed a small nip on his hand and it was nothing serious. He stroked their heads, repeating over and over that he was truly okay until their breathing slowed. Unable to contain her relief, Riggy clung to him, murmuring words that were lost on him. Juan held her close, imagining she was offering a prayer of thanks to the heavens. Dorothy continued to sob, and Juan guessed she was trying to tell him just how frightened she had been. He held them both tightly, silently blaming himself for failing them and causing such distress. After a while, the three of them headed back inside, but the harsh croak of a crow on the roof seemed to announce that the peace would be short-lived. Out in the shed, Juan began the grim task of skinning the wolf with firm, professional cuts. He used a sharpened blade to skillfully separate the hide from the muscle. Though he made it look easy, he quickly discovered that the reality required far more time and physical effort than he had anticipated. He wiped the sweat from his brow, thinking that he would have to find a more efficient method next time, as this was grueling work. Still, he pressed on, determined to secure food for his family. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Rigi, calling his name softly. Juan turned, surprised to see her there, and greeted her cheerfully as he stepped out to see what she needed. She placed a wooden bucket before him, signaling for him to put the meat inside. Rigi tried to explain herself through a series of animated gestures, pointing at the fresh meat, the haunches, and then mimicking other animals so he would understand. Finally, a light dawned on Juan. She wanted him to store the meat in the bucket for processing. As he looked at her, he suddenly remembered he needed to find a way to communicate more clearly. Searching his memory for the right words, Juan tried to recall how to say thank you in her language. He hesitated, his tongue feeling heavy and clumsy as he attempted to pronounce it. "Go, Ama," he stammered. At the sound, Rigi's eyes widened in surprise before a radiant smile broke across her face. Her reaction left Juan utterly bewildered, and he began to worry that he had accidentally said something offensive. Rigi looked up at him, her gaze lingering, and corrected him softly, asking if he meant to say Goma. They stood there for a long, close moment, the air between them thick with a newfound sense of complicity. With a warm, genuine smile, Juan repeated the word properly, leaving Rigi stunned. When she responded that it was nothing, the simple back and forth left her even more confused. She had no idea how to react to such a common courtesy. A simple thank you was something she had never heard from her own family. It was a small gesture, but for Rigi, it was one of many firsts she was experiencing with this man. Suddenly, the memory of their first kiss flashed in her mind, and her face flushed crimson. A mix of shyness and burning curiosity surged within her. She turned and bolted away, her heart racing as she wondered if he had ever kissed another woman before. The overwhelming swirl of emotions made her heart ache, and for a moment, she felt like she might cry from the sheer intensity of it all. Later, they returned to the shed, and Rigi entered in silence, the quietude of the space settling over them. She thought to herself that processing meat was traditionally a woman's job, and it struck her as strange that Juan took to it so naturally. Why was he like this? Despite her confusion, the two of them worked the meat together with a surprising, fluid coordination. Rigi felt her mind wandering again, questioning what she should do, and wondering if this strange pull she felt was actually love. In an involuntary gesture born of expectation, she slowly closed her eyes. Seeing this, Juan did not hesitate. He leaned in and placed a tender kiss on her forehead. The softness of the kiss made her heart throb with warmth and happiness, but she immediately pulled back, scolding herself for being a fool and assuming he would go further. Juan remained still, watching her with a serene and peaceful face. Rigi gripped her head in a mock panic, wondering if he now thought she had been begging for a real kiss. She looked up to face him, determined this time to keep her eyes wide open so there would be no more misunderstandings. But Juan leaned in once more, and this time, it was a deep, real kiss that caught her completely off guard. When he pulled away, he looked at her with eyes filled with a profound tenderness, love, and respect. Somewhat embarrassed by the intensity of the moment, Juan hoisted the bucket of meat. But noticing Dorothy was missing, he called out in confusion. He soon realized that the little girl had been peeking through the doorway. The entire time, she had witnessed the whole passionate exchange. Upon realizing they had been watched, Rigi let out a shriek of pure embarrassment and fled into the house to hide her burning face. After that bashful episode, the small family decided to take a walk through the forest, with Rigi leading the way while Juan and Dorothy followed behind in a scene of calm, domestic warmth. Along the path, Dorothy skipped ahead happily, suddenly stopping to reach out, her small hands as if she wanted to help. Juan carried the heavy bucket. Juan smiled and thanked her sweetly for the adorable gesture, but Dorothy froze, her brow furrowed in a pout. Juan was puzzled until it clicked. He hadn't used her name. Understanding now, he knelt down and thanked Dorothy with genuine affection for her help. At the sound of her new name, the little girl's face lit up like the midday sun and she beamed with joy. With a newfound burst of joy, Dorothy helped her new father push the heavy bucket along. Inside the house, Rigi carefully stroked the wolfskin, a trophy of Juan's prowess. Juan, sitting across from her, wondered for a moment why she would want to hang such a pungent pelt inside their home. But then it occurred to him that perhaps the skin held a deeper meaning for her. He watched her and noticed how much she seemed to value it, which filled him with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Rigi and Dorothy sat beside the pelt together. The little girl, brimming with curiosity, brushed the soft fur with her hand. In an innocent and adorable gesture, Dorothy began to comb the wolf's hair using a small stone she had found. Seeing this, Rigi couldn't help but smile. creating a moment of domestic warmth that was truly happy. Juan found himself smiling too, easily swept up in their collective joy. A little while later, Rigi stepped outside to begin preparing their meal, carefully laying out pieces of fresh meat. The reddish steaks, cut with painstaking care, promised a dinner that would be both abundant and nourishing. Juan watched her work the meat intently, realizing that this was how they preserved their food in this world. He made a mental note to pay close attention so he could learn to do it himself next time. He smiled, seeing how pleased she was with the bit of animal fat he had managed to save, glad that his instinct to keep it had proven useful. Still, the reality of his situation pressed on him. He knew he had much to learn in this implacable new world. He needed to figure out quickly what held value here, how people bought, sold, and traded, and he wanted to familiarize himself with their ways as soon as possible. With that thought, he stood up, determined to stop resting and get back to work immediately. However, as he rose, Rigi stopped him, her face etched with alarm and worry. She gestured frantically, pleading with him to sit back down and rest his body. Juan simply shook his head with a reassuring smile, trying to show her that he had rested enough and that his aches had faded. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder to assure her that he wouldn't overexert himself and that she could be at peace. Rigi hesitated for a heartbeat, then finally nodded and stepped back to give him his space. Juan took his axe and headed into the forest, looking for a moderately sized tree to practice on. He had heard that oak was excellent for firewood, though he wasn't entirely sure how to recognize it yet. Relying on his raw power, he raised the axe and channeled his strength into a decisive swing. It was a powerful blow that showcased his extraordinary strength. But because he used a bit too much force, the axe suddenly flew out of his hands, spinning out of control. He clutched his head in alarm, unable to believe he had done something so foolish. After searching for a while, he finally managed to gather a sufficient amount of wood to keep his family warm. He hoisted the heavy basket of firewood onto his back and returned home cheerfully, ready for a cozy night. Upon entering, he found Rigi and Dorothy waiting with faces full of concern. Before he could even process what was happening, Rigi ran over, took his hand, and pulled him along urgently. She sat him down abruptly, an unexpected act that left Juan completely bewildered. She then took his rough hand in hers and began to carefully wipe away the dirt and grime. Juan, feeling a bit shy, thanked her softly while Dorothy watched curiously from a distance. Suddenly, the little girl bolted away as if struck by a brilliant idea. She ran to the basin and, with her tiny hands, filled a small container with water. Though she was clumsy and left a trail of puddles across the floor, she made it back and, without a moment's hesitation, splashed the water directly onto Juan in a surprised gesture of help. Soaked by the cold water, Juan could only smile resignedly, finding it impossible to be angry with his adorable daughter. Seeing the scene, Rigi broke into laughter, and the atmosphere in the cabin became light and joyful. Dorothy, however, looked a little disappointed, as if she had expected a different reaction from her new father. Juan smiled, knelt down, and stroked her head, thanking her tenderly. At that, Dorothy spun around to run back out, eager to keep helping him, and a startled Juan had to jump up to stop her. Rigi laughed at the adorable chaos and felt as though she were living in a beautiful dream. Only a few days ago, she had thought happiness was impossible, but now that it was within her grasp, she only wanted to protect the smiles of Rigi and Dorothy forever. That evening, a column of warm smoke began to rise from the chimney of the wooden house, curling toward the sky as a silent herald of hope and the beginning of a new life for their small family. That night, the three of them gathered around the table to enjoy a bountiful dinner, though little Dorothy had already succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep. They looked at each other in silence, sharing a newfound warmth and a quiet mutual understanding. After the meal, Dorothy slept soundly with her thumb in her mouth, an image so innocent and precious that Juan and Rigi couldn't help but let out a soft laugh, savoring this rare moment of domestic peace. Juan carefully scooped Dorothy into his arms. She remained deep in her dreams after a long day of play. He stood up while Rigi remained at the table, silently gathering the remnants of their meal, moving toward the bed where the fire in the hearth crackled, filling the room with a gentle heat. He laid the girl down with the utmost care. He covered her with a blanket in a gesture overflowing with fatherly love, ensuring she was tucked in before stepping back out toward the courtyard, where the flickering candlelight illuminated a quiet corner of the patio. Inside, Rigi was occupied with her chores, washing up by the firelight. Juan entered silently, not wanting to disturb her, but suddenly reached out and took her hand in a gesture that was both unexpected and slightly blunt. Rigi looked up, her face flushing crimson and her heart racing at his sudden proximity. Juan himself felt a wave of bewilderment, unable to fully grasp why he was acting this way, as if some invisible, irresistible force was drawing them together. The air grew still and silent as he gently pulled her into an unexpected but tender embrace. Huddled in his strong arms, Rigi looked up at him with burning cheeks, still clutching a damp cloth in her hand. With a touch of sweetness, she used the cloth to gently wipe the beads of sweat from the nape of his neck, a quiet act of care. Although her heart was pounding against her ribs, Riggy forced herself to push past her embarrassment, reminding herself that this was simply what a wife should do for her husband. Gaining a bit of courage, she softly lifted the hem of his shirt to reveal his firm abdomen, intending to dry the sweat there. The unexpected contact sent a jolt of nervous energy through them both. She was overwhelmed with bashfulness while he offered a pleased, tender smile. His gaze became softer, carrying a playful yet warm light. However, despite her efforts to remain calm, Riggy found the sheer weight of the intimacy almost too much to bear. Noticing her hesitation, Juan took her hand once more, a surprised gesture filled with a deep, lingering tenderness. He looked directly into her eyes, and the atmosphere shifted into something profoundly romantic, making Riggy's heart skip a beat. He leaned in and whispered a suggestive invitation into her ear. It was time to sleep. Hand in hand, they entered the house's only bedroom together. He guided her gently toward the bed with a look full of affection and desire. Under the dim glow of the lantern, their eyes met, and the air between them turned heavy with a passionate, romantic heat. Riggy remained shy, but she did not resist, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. He leaned over her, savoring the softness and warmth of the woman before him. Juan thought to himself that she truly was his wife, and he prayed silently that they would never be parted. He found himself begging that distant Santa Claus never to take them away, and to let him protect their smiles until the day he died. In this world, the wealthy nobility might not understand, but for common folk, it was perfectly normal for the entire family to share a single room. Riggy lay there, well aware of what usually transpired on a couple's wedding night, and for a moment, the jagged, painful memories of her violent father clawed at her mind. The echoes of his threat still haunted her. The memory of him shouting that he would hit her harder if she cried. She remembered the nights following those beatings, when her mother's trembling sobs would continue until dawn, leaving Riggy to live in a state of perpetual fear. She had often wondered when her own long nights would finally find peace, fearing her mother's tears were a grim portrait of her own future. However, the next morning, she woke to the gentle sound of firewood crackling in the hearth. She blinked her eyes open, startled to find herself waking up to a world that felt fundamentally different than the one she had always known. She woke in the bed nestled between Juan and Dorothy, blinking as she recalled the night she had spent sleeping on the hard floor. Her head was resting on his arm, a closeness so unexpected it made her breath hitch. Beside her, Dorothy slept soundly in the crook of Juan's other arm, radiating a gentle warmth and peace. Riggy let out a long, shaky sigh of relief. The wedding night she had always feared in her nightmares wasn't bitter or violent, but serene and sweet. She snuggled closer into Juan's chest, realizing that since this man had entered her life, her entire world had shifted on its axis. Suddenly, she felt him stir and startle awake. He smiled and pulled both mother and daughter into a firm, protective embrace that made her heart hammer as if it might burst from her chest. A happy smile finally touched her lips, a tingling, pleasant sensation she never wanted to end after a night of truly restorative sleep. Juan opened his eyes to find Dorothy still dozing in his lap. He sat up with painstaking care to avoid waking the child, reaching out to brush her cheek with a tender, fatherly touch. Stepping outside, he found Riggy already hard at work, preparing for the new day. Seeing her straining, Juan gently took a heavy bucket from her hands. He offered a small smile that left her flustered and blushing, then proceeded to wring out a towel with a display of strength that left her wide-eyed. He turned to her and called out softly, "Suzune?" Riggy looked at him, tilted her head in confusion. "Suzune, are you awake? Honey, did you sleep well?" The term of endearment made Riggy's face turn bright red instantly. She lowered her head, wondering if Honey was a formal title or a secret, intimate way of naming her. Juan, too, felt a wave of awkwardness, scratching his head and wondering if he'd made her too nervous. With a shy glance, Riggy looked up and whispered a request for him to keep calling her Honey. Juan grinned and repeated it with such tenderness that she had to cover her face in embarrassment. Finding her reaction adorable, he teased her a little more, gently turning her to face him. "Honey, look at me." At that moment, Dorothy began rubbing her eyes, alerted by their chatter. In the hazy border of sleep, she had been dreaming of a giant flying chicken leg. She sat up groggily, a bit of drool at the corner of her mouth, a picture of pure innocence, only to flop back down onto the floor, still heavy with sleep. Alarmed, Juan and Riggy both rushed to her side, but Dorothy quickly scrambled up to hug their legs affectionately. Her eyes suddenly doubled in size when she spotted the piles of fresh meat. To her, whether it was wolf or dragon didn't matter. Meat was meat. Seeing the little girl so devoted to the prospect of a feast, the two parents couldn't help but burst into laughter. "Meat!" Juan joined in cheerfully. Dorothy didn't hesitate, practically diving toward the bucket while chanting, "Meat! Meat!" Watching his daughter's unbridled enthusiasm, Juan swore to himself that he would become a hunter beyond compare. He gripped his axe, ready to face any beast the forest could throw at him. This time he moved with confidence, his sharpened blade a weight of security in his hand. However, the deeper he ventured into the lush, overgrown woods, the more the air began to sour. An unsettling sensation wrapped around him, a heavy omen of ill fortune. Despite the vastness of the forest, the air felt thin, making it hard to breathe. He scanned the shadows, wondering what kind of monster would emerge this time. Suddenly, the crunch of footsteps reached his ears. He spun around, bracing for a beast, but found a human silhouette instead. A man wearing a heavy cloak that obscured his features walked in silence, seemingly unaware of Juan's presence. When the stranger finally turned, he revealed an aged, weathered face with eyes as sharp and cold as a hunting knife. Juan stood frozen, wondering who this mysterious man was and what business he could possibly have in such a remote part of the woods. A short while later, the scene shifts back to the hooded man from earlier. He stands silently in the forest, staring at the blood scattered across the ground. Carefully examining the traces left behind, he mutters to himself, "There are traces of a beast here too." For tracks this obvious to remain behind, it was probably a massive animal. As he slowly walks forward, his mind continues piecing everything together. Even with someone helping him, I assumed he simply didn't realize it, but he was alone. After observing that huge mountain dweller for several days, he's a man who doesn't even properly know how to handle a blade. His eyes narrow as he follows the trail deeper into the forest, every new sign only making the situation more unbelievable. Soon, he notices more bloodstains along the path. Stopping for a moment, he looks down at them and says in disbelief, "That giant who looks completely ignorant about hunting killed a massive beast? Impossible. Even a professional hunter would struggle to hunt a huge beast alone without a weapon. I need to verify it myself." With that thought, he continues moving ahead, determination filling his expression. The scene then returns to the exact moment when the hooded man suddenly appeared in front of Juan. The two stand face to face in silence, but the hooded man's attention is fixed entirely on Juan's hand. His sharp eyes carefully study the marks covering it, and his thoughts begin racing once again. Judging by the shape of the wounds, these are definitely wolf bites. But why has the surface healed over like that? If he had really been bitten that severely, the infection and fever should have killed him already. If the bones were exposed, then the blood vessels and muscles should all have been shredded apart. He shouldn't be able to move around. It is perfectly fine after suffering injuries like those. The more he thinks about it, the stranger the situation becomes. Then a single possibility suddenly forms in his mind. Then there's only one explanation. Could this man be a mage, and a very rare one at that? For a brief moment, confusion appears on his face. Yet deep inside, excitement is already beginning to grow. Continuing his thoughts silently, he says to himself, "There are mages in this world, people ordinary folk rarely ever encounter. If this man truly is a mage, then the opportunity has finally come." And the instant he reaches that conclusion, a deeply unsettling smile slowly spreads across his face beneath the hood. His eyes fill with dark anticipation. As he whispers the words he never thought he would say again. A chance for revenge. One I thought would never come until the day I died. On the other side, after seeing this strange and mysterious man, Juan could not help but feel uneasy. Countless thoughts ran through his mind as he silently wondered, what kind of person is he? The old man beneath the hood remained quiet for a moment, before finally beginning to speak about his past. His voice sounded calm, but there was a deep bitterness hidden within it, as if the weight of many painful years still clung to every word he spoke. "I'm an old, stubborn man now," he said slowly, "but there was once a time when I too was a vigorous young man. If you became a forest keeper managing a noble's mountain or woodland, you were obligated to spend a certain period fighting on the battlefield. And if you earned military merit there, you could even become one of the Lord's retainers." As he continued speaking, his eyes seemed to drift far into the past, remembering the dreams he once carried in his youth. "I left my father behind and wandered from village to village, hoping to become a mountain dweller and an independent hunter. Not long after, I became the mountain keeper of a certain village. It was a mountain overflowing with abundance. Game was plentiful, the forests were rich, and life seemed peaceful. Its only flaw was the lack of firewood. Since even commoners were allowed to enter the Lord's forest, people always had to venture deeper into the mountains to gather wood." A faint, bitter smile appeared on his face. "Back then, I thought it was actually a good opportunity. I believed it would help me learn the terrain better. Never once did I stop to consider why the villagers only gathered firewood from the shallow parts of the mountain." For a moment, silence filled the air before he continued in a colder tone. "A forest keeper tasked with protecting and managing the Lord's woods must have all four limbs intact when signing the contract. Right before the official contract was finalized, I failed to meet those conditions, and I was rejected." His expression darkened as the memories became heavier. "I never could have anticipated it. I never imagined that goblins lived within those mountains." The hatred in his voice became impossible to hide now. Goblins kidnap human women and breed offspring with them. Later, I learned that the village where women kept disappearing and dying had become infamous. Nearby is the Goblin Village. The old man clenched his fists tightly beneath. His cloak as decades of resentment surfaced within him once more. "I endured a wretched existence after that. Everything was taken from me and my life was thrown into ruin. Yet I continued living only for a single purpose, waiting for the day I could finally take revenge on the goblins, who destroyed everything I had. Even now, the pain in his eyes had not faded. Though I despised the villagers for hiding the truth from me, I still lived alongside them for decades. The only thing keeping me alive was the obsession that someday, somehow, I would have my revenge on those bastards. This man can do it. With those words, the scene shifts back to the present, and the old hooded man's thoughts become completely focused on the protagonist. As he stares at Juan, his mind begins carefully analyzing him once again. That enormous frame and that monstrous strength. You could never find someone like him around here. And on top of that, he possesses an absurd healing ability. The old man's eyes narrow beneath the shadow of his hood as his thoughts grow darker. Right now, the goblins are hiding deep within the mountains. But once they begin running short of women, they will definitely attack the village again. Before that happens, I'll turn this bastard into an exceptional hunter. A cold determination settles over him as he silently finalizes his plan. I need to keep the existence of the goblin den hidden until the contract is signed. Once the contract is made, the binding force will take effect, and he won't be able to simply run away whenever he wants. At that moment, Juan slightly bows his head toward the old man, showing him a basic form of respect. However, even while receiving the greeting, the hooded man remains cautious. Observing Juan carefully, he thinks to himself, even while greeting me, he's keeping his center of gravity shifted backward. He's smiling, but he hasn't lowered his guard at all. Realizing this, the old man becomes even more certain that Juan is not as simple-minded as he first appeared. Then, looking directly at him, the hooded man says, "From today onward, I'll pass everything I know on to you. You'll become a fine hunter." Hearing those sudden words, Juan becomes slightly confused. He cannot fully understand the old man's intentions or why he suddenly wishes to teach him. Even so, before he can question it further, the scene begins to shift once again. The next day arrives. Early in the morning, Juan slowly wakes up and mutters sleepily, "It feels like I only closed my eyes for a moment." And it's already morning. Inside the house, Rigi and Dorothy are grilling meat over the fire. While quietly preparing for the day, Juan gets up and starts heading outside. One of the windows is open, and as he glances through it, he notices the old hooded man standing outside the house. The moment Juan sees him, his expression becomes slightly cautious again. I didn't want to tell him to come inside the house, Juan thinks to himself. When I'm not around, I don't want someone getting used to entering a house where only Rigi and Dorothy are staying. Even while preparing himself for the day, Juan continues watching the old man carefully from inside the house. Outside, the hooded man stands there smiling faintly, but the smile feels strangely unsettling. Seeing that expression, Juan cannot help but think, seriously, that's an awfully suspicious smile. The moment Juan saw that suspicious smile on the old man's face, an old memory suddenly flashed through his mind. Comparing the expression to something from his previous life, he thought to himself, that smile looks exactly like the HR manager during salary negotiations. Even so, Juan could tell that the old man was at least trying to behave politely in his own strange way. Watching him carefully, Juan continued thinking, still, it seems like he's learning how to politely refuse things, so I should work hard teaching him. Just then, Rigi called out Juan's name from behind him. Turning toward her, Juan replied calmly, Rigi, I'm fine. I'll be back soon. As he looked at her preparing food for him, his expression softened slightly. In his mind, he quietly thought, she's preparing a lunchbox for me like a wife would. She's really trying her best. A faint smile appeared on his face as another thought crossed his mind. She's adorable. Nearby, little Dorothy had been silently watching her mother this entire time. The moment she realized Juan was about to leave, she hurried toward the door as if trying to stop him from going. At the same time, Rigi quickly handed Juan the lunchbox and told him to take it along. Hurry! You need to go quickly, she said nervously before adding, make sure you eat properly. Watching the two of them care about him, so sincerely filled Juan with an unfamiliar warmth. Looking at them quietly, he thought to himself, having a family that looks after me really is something wonderful. Rigi continued staring at him with worried eyes before finally saying, come back safely. Hearing those words, Juan silently interpreted them in his own way. That's probably her way of saying, come back safely. Then Rigi repeated once again, almost as if she desperately wanted to make sure he understood. Come back safely. This time, Juan answered her directly with a small smile. I will. At that exact moment, little Dorothy came running over as well and, in her tiny voice, told her father to return safely too. Looking at her, Juan once again replied gently, I will. As he stood there watching the smiles on the faces of his new family, warmth slowly filled his heart. Seeing both Rigi and Dorothy smiling at him so innocently, Juan could not help but think, my suddenly acquired wife and daughter are just too adorable. However, for now, he still had to follow the old man deeper into the mountains. The hooded elder continued walking ahead without stopping, while Juan followed behind him for quite some time. After walking such a long distance, Juan began feeling increasingly suspicious. What exactly is he trying to show me that requires this much walking? He wondered internally while continuing to follow him. Finally, the old man suddenly stopped at a certain spot. He spoke in his unusual manner, his words sounding difficult to understand at first. After listening carefully for a moment, Juan slowly realized what he meant. Is he telling me to look at the ground? At the same time, the old man began, demonstrating something with his feet on the soil beneath them. Juan carefully observed his movements, and the moment he noticed the marks left behind, his expression changed slightly. His footprints are strange.